Are you struggling to understand spoken Portuguese, feeling lost as native speakers fly through conversations? It's a very common complaint. It's no wonder my videos on this topic have over 250,000 views. Because here's the thing, many learners overlook one crucial piece that keeps them from catching native speakers' words. By the end of this video, you will discover why hidden syllables could be the key to your comprehension struggles. Plus, I'll share the most common words with these hidden symbols to help you start improving right away. I've taught hundreds of students in my Portuguese Pro program, guiding them from struggling to understand basic conversations to confidently engaging with natives. And just like you, they battled with listening comprehension, but with the right strategies, they transformed their listening skills. Like Peter, who amazed himself with how much he could understand when he was watching the Portuguese TV. So let's talk about why understanding spoken Portuguese can feel impossible at times. Many learners focus on vocabulary and grammar, but they often overlook the fundamental nature of Portuguese pronunciation, especially how sounds get reduced in natural speech. This is the number one mistake that can leave you feel lost in every conversation. So you've probably experienced this. You can follow your language app perfectly, but when your Portuguese neighbor speaks at a normal speed, it sounds like they're speaking a completely different language. And that's because you are expecting to hear what you would see written down. So if your neighbor were to ask, "O que andas a fazer?" which means, "What are you up to?" you would actually hear, "O que andas a fazer?" Completely different. So only two of these syllables in that sentence were stressed and therefore easy to hear. Now, if you have seen this video on pronunciation, I do go into a lot more detail on the rules of stress, but to quickly bring you up to speed, in Portuguese, the default rule for stress is that it goes on the penultimate syllable. So in the word andas, we're only going to stress an and reduce das. So we will close down the second A. It's not going to be an a, it's going to be a closed a. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, and one of them is if a word ends in R. The stress isn't going to go on the penultimate syllable, it's going to go at the end. So in fazer, we're going to reduce f and stress zer. We actually break down an entire conversation like this, comparing what you would see written down versus what you will actually hear in a conversation with a native speaker in my free lesson for beginners. So if you want to see this in action, just comment lesson and we will send you the link. So here's what is really happening. Portuguese is what we call a stress-timed language. This means we don't stress all the syllables equally, like you would in Spanish, for example. We stress syllables at regular intervals and reduce or swallow the rest. And this is exactly what happens in English too. Think about the phrase, "The cat sat on the mat." Cat, sat, and mat are stressed, but the other words, they're barely audible. So we are reducing those sounds, so beginners learning English would have a hard time hearing them. The exact same thing is happening in Portuguese. O que andas a fazer is only being stressed in two places. So let's go over some of the most common reduced forms that you will hear every day. And if you can recognize these when they are spoken, your listening comprehension is going to skyrocket. The first one, very common, the word for thank you. Obrigado. Now, if we split this into syllables and use that default rule that I mentioned earlier, the stress is going to fall on the penultimate syllable, which is ga. So this is why the rest of the word seems to get completely swallowed up and ends up sounding like this. Obrigado. Obrigado. Desculpa. Again, we split it into syllables. The penultimate syllable is ku, so it's going to sound like this. Desculpa. Desculpa. Now, if we take the common farewell, até logo, até logo, two things are going to happen here. The word até has an accent on it, so that's actually going to override our default rule for stress. We have to put the stress on the accent. So até is going to become te. But we go back to our default rule for the word logo because it doesn't have an accent there. So which is the penultimate syllable? It's lo. So we're only going to hear te logo. The rest of the sounds disappear. A very common sound to drop off is the ES at the beginning of a word beginning with ES. So, for example, estou aqui. Estou aqui. Está bem. Está bem. Espera. Espera. Or even the word for station. Estação. Estação. This accent is going at the end because of that tilde on top of the A. That tells me the stress must go here. More common phrases that get reduced. Não becomes ne. Para becomes pra. And finally, the word that everybody wants to say incorrectly, que. You have to remember that we need a nice closed E at the end of this. It's not actually que, it's que. So if I was saying something like que giro, you would hear que giro. That ending almost disappears. Once you understand this rhythm, you will start hearing these patterns everywhere, and then all that is left to do is to practice, practice, practice. Recently, I made this video that dives deep onto how to do listening practice adjusted for your level, so you should check that video out next. But a quick recap is, I want you to use short audio clips rather than very long ones, because to improve our listening, we want to be listening actively and not passively. So instead of using very long form media like movies or talk radio, for example, take a 30-second conversation and listen to it multiple times. Write down the keywords that you recognize and then check against a transcript. This is what we do in my program with short dialogues. We go through the scenario of greeting a friend in the street in my free lesson for beginners. If you haven't attended that already, the link to sign up is in the description and you can really see what we're talking about here. Next, I need you to focus on the most frequent words. With just a few hundred common words, you can understand 50 to 75% of daily conversation. I did a whole video on this and I even created flashcards of the top 100 words, which you can also find in the description of this video. Third, make sure you practice these reduced forms yourself when you're out and about. Try using tá bom instead of está bom. This trains your brain to recognize these patterns. Understanding how stress timing works can significantly enhance your listening skills, and this knowledge is going to empower you to follow conversations more closely and respond with confidence. Remember, everyone who now speaks great Portuguese started exactly where you are today. The difference is that they learn to work with the natural rhythm of the language instead of fighting against it. Sharon is a perfect example of this listening transformation. She relocated to the Algarve completely solo from the US, and when she started to learn Portuguese, she really struggled with her listening comprehension.
It was really even difficult for me to hear what those sounds were. And I did work with a few other apps that you can download on your phone. But what I realized is that everything was a little bit disjointed. And most importantly, I got no feedback. I had no one telling me, oh, this is really the sound that you want to make, that kind of thing.
She set herself a goal. She thought it would take her 5 years to be good enough to understand Portuguese to do volunteer work. But once she understood strategies like this and how the sounds in Portuguese get reduced in natural speech, her listening skills improved much faster than expected. She now volunteers with a local food charity, working alongside Portuguese speakers for hours at a time.
I speak Portuguese to some degree every single day, whether it's at the shops or taking a walk with a friend, or just this past Friday, I had some questions for my banker and sat down with the banker and did the entire conversation in Portuguese back and forth. And so that was a huge win for me. Friday evening, I spent with a colleague from ReFood. I went to her art exhibit where she had a painting exhibited. And afterwards, she took me back to her house with a couple of other Portuguese friends. And we spoke Portuguese the entire evening. And I found out some things I didn't know about her. And it was just, that's what I can do now.
So if you are ready to break through this listening barrier like Sharon did and finally understand native Portuguese speakers, I would love you to come along to my free lesson for beginners, which is linked in the description. And if you want to hear more about Sharon's story, the link to her whole interview is there below as well. I'll be back next week with more tips and tutorials to build your confidence and conversation skills in Portuguese, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a thing. Ciao for now.